4 shots pumped into her lover's body. Then she turned the gun on herself. It was a clean shot to the head, and she knew what she was doing. She'd been trained to use the weapon. She was a traffic officer after all. Just days later, in Brakpan, a young father, only 40 years old, killed his 2 adorable children and thereafter took his own life. He strangled them, and then he hanged himself in a nearby field. The horror for the children is unimaginable. Watching your father kill your brother, knowing you are next. What storm could be so fierce, so unrelenting and isolating that death seems the only escape? For some, it's a bottle of pills. Others, stepping off an edge, a bridge, a building, and still others, a violent and bloody end. September is Suicide Prevention Month, and that tells us these stories are all too common in South Africa. Dan Wolf is a psychologist and director at the Houghton House Group of Treatment Centers and joins us now to help us understand. Dan, I appreciate your time. It's a difficult subject to broach, but nonetheless, these stories are all too common. Just perhaps give us the background. How prevalent is suicide, or at least the attempt of it, in South Africa? What key figures do you have?
Well, Bongani, thank you so much for having me on the show this morning. Just hearing you sort of describe those incidents leaves me quite speechless. And I think what I could only default to think about is the phenomena of mental illness. You were not talking about any kind of normative behavior. And I think that is certainly something that people need to understand deeply. Suicide is an abnormal outcome to stressful situations. People default to an idea that life is stressful and there's financial pressures and all sorts of other kind of relationship turmoil, and these are possibilities. And I think that that's a mistake. I think what we need to appreciate is suicide is an abnormal outcome to stress, and it is indicative of mental illness. That being said, as there is a recognition of mental illness as life unfolds, the prevalence and the understanding of suicide is developing, and people are starting to speak about what perhaps previously was unthinkable. I mean, an announcement like this on public radio could not have happened some years ago. I don't know if you agree with that, but that is certainly some of the thoughts that have come to mind listening to you speak.
I appreciate what you mean in terms of the abnormality of the outcome. Certainly many people face all kinds of financial pressures, perhaps even relationships that sour, that don't go right, and don't resort to this as a solution, as a way out. But nonetheless, I've got a figure of something like 280,000 attempts reported in South Africa. That tells you that this is a growing problem that can't be ignored.
Yes, without a doubt. And I think when we talk about not ignoring the problem, I think what we need to understand is that there is usually some level of uncertainty. I mean, these acts that you've described present as absolutely definitive. But what is clearly indicated is that many individuals have expressed their attempt, have made some effort at engaging people in their lives to speak about their level of distress. And there are many myths that exist.
Let me interrupt you there, Dan. Please take me through some of those, because I think sometimes we think we mean well when we respond to these things, but we don't know that perhaps we're part of creating the stigma. So just talk me through some of the things that are myths that people say, people think, without realizing that quite often by expressing those, we're shutting the door down to people who really need help?
Well, one of the myths that come to mind is that talking about suicide with a depressed person will probably cause them to commit suicide. And, that is not true. Many depressed people who have suicidal thoughts or plans are relieved when someone knows about them and is able to assist them. And discussing suicidality with a depressed person will not lead them to commit suicide. Another thing, people who commit suicide are selfish and weak. Many people who commit suicide suffer from very real mental disorders that may not have been recognized. Another phenomena is, suicide is caused by stress, as I mentioned. I mean, a behavioral trigger is not a cause. Another phenomena which comes to mind is that there's nothing that can be done for a person who is suicidal. There are billions pumped into pharmaceutical companies. There are organic responses that address people's physical conditions that can be shifted and fundamentally shift their way of being and their ability to engage with others and to engage with the world around them. So these are just some of the myths that come to mind. Another thing is suicide is an impulsive act. Many people who commit suicide have experienced suicidal thoughts and have contemplated taking their own life before. So, one has to get, I think, the education around the topic as the phenomena becomes increasingly more and more prevalent and known. There needs to be an increase in education, which I think could go a long way in correcting the stats, the horrifying stats that you're talking about.
How do people who are concerned that their loved one may be having suicidal thoughts, maybe they've attempted in the past, how do we rally around somebody we want to support?
Well, I think that what you're now talking about is one of the challenges of our society, and that is just having straightforward, heart-to-heart, difficult conversations, perhaps putting the phone down for a short while, not sending the person a text message, and saying, I genuinely am concerned about you. I would like to understand what's going on. I've noticed a very clear deterioration in your behavior, whatever it may be. But it's about being prepared to engage the individual directly and respectfully, because so often people find great difficulty accessing the support that they genuinely need. And that's often because there isn't a drive towards meaningful communication between people who spend hours and hours together. And I think that is one of the horrors that people often face post-suicide, is I spent so much time with this person and I knew nothing.
Well, this is part of the difficulty. I mean, is this something that could only be assisted by a health professional? Because in some circumstances, for example, I'm reminded of that mother in the Eastern Cape who fed her children rat poison before she took some herself because she just couldn't see a way out in terms of being able to support them. Now, somebody in that circumstance would not necessarily be able to have the means to approach a therapist on an ongoing basis. Do you know what I mean? It's one thing to phone a helpline in a moment of crisis, but for so many people, part of what the difficulty is where would I even begin? I can go to a clinic for a headache or for a wound or an injury, but who helps put me together mentally if I'm breaking me down and if I don't even have the resources to do so?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what you're describing is quite a peripheral individual. I mean, even though the method that you're touching on is bizarre and almost kind of smacks of a level of poverty and desperation. So, I guess the deterioration in, the suicidality in the context of an impoverished environment is most likely going to reflect the environment as a whole. And that is very fragmented. You're describing an individual who sounds incredibly isolated. And certainly, as a community, we can't wait for health professions. I mean, obviously, the helplines create awareness, and there is fantastic work being done by SADAG, the Depression and Anxiety Support Group. But as individuals, we have a responsibility to engage meaningfully, to smile at the people standing next to us, to display a genuine interest in the lives of the people that are around us. And, I guess we all very often are guilty in living in a very siloed environment. Sometimes, I just look at the deterioration in contact that's been brought about through technology. There was a time that people persisted in wanting to get hold of each other and weren't satisfied with superficial responses. And sometimes, I think we have to kind of think quite cautiously about, are we connecting meaningfully to each other? Because so often a connection is what translates into a meaningful life.
And isn't that what we're all seeking? Connection, that sense of being seen, that sense of being heard. Reach out and touch and make this world a better place. Dan Wolf, psychologist and director at the Houghton House Group of Treatment Centers.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions,
your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.